What do you get when you combine an inexperienced team, a popular movie license, and brand new console hardware? Sometimes you get gold. That's right, today we're taking a look back at GoldenEye 007 and Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64. These two shooters from Rare had a huge impact on the industry at the time, redefining what you might expect from a console first-person shooter. Now, in terms of both single-player and multiplayer gameplay, there really wasn't much else like it at the time, and we're going to take a look back at some of those features. But more importantly, I really wanted to see just how these games actually run. We know that they don't actually run very well at all, if you've played any of them, but what are the actual numbers? Well, we're going to find that out. In the case of Perfect Dark, I really wanted to see how it would hold up both in the high and low res mode, and in the case of GoldenEye, I'll actually show you how to disable anti-aliasing on real Nintendo 64 hardware and squeeze out some better image quality and, of course, slightly faster performance. So, without further ado, let's get started with GoldenEye. It was August 1997 when GoldenEye 007 hit the Nintendo 64. While Turok Dinosaur Hunter had been released a few months earlier and impressed players with smooth animations and massive worlds, GoldenEye offered something different. Something that would ultimately contribute to console first-person shooters that we know today. The game actually started life on the Super NES as a side-scrolling game using pre-rendered sprites similar to Donkey Kong Country. But Martin Hollis, the game's director, insisted on moving the game to Nintendo's next-generation platform instead. Development was hardly a simple thing. The game was created by just 10 people after all, 8 of which had never worked on a game before. And of course, lots of experimentation followed. During these early days when Nintendo 64 was still known as Project Reality, the team was mainly working with a Silicon Graphics Onyx workstation, the closest thing to what the console would ultimately become. The game started life as a rail shooter, inspired by the likes of Virtua Cop. At the beginning, the idea was to create a game similar to this, but with more of a focus on interactive environments with smarter foes and an expanded moveset. But over time and through experimentation, the team determined that free movement was simply much more fun and began working in that direction instead. You can still see the influence of the rail shooter days in certain missions, however. Working through Statue Park, for instance, sees players moving forward through an environment as enemies seemingly pop out from behind various bits of cover. It has the flow of a rail shooter here, and there are other missions like this. Now, at this point in development, you have to remember that there really had not been a truly great console first-person shooter yet. Sure, we had stuff like Alien vs Predator on the Jag, but it was still a simplistic game with subpar controls. One of the key elements that GoldenEye nailed was the feel of the game. The controls on offer were very forward-looking at the time, and the team even went so far as to allow players to use 2 Nintendo 64 controllers simultaneously for dual analog action. Beyond that, the game just looked and felt great in motion. The animation and movement of your weapon, the gentle camera sway, and the sense of weight that you have in the game. It's something that GoldenEye absolutely nailed. Then there is the level design itself. Following the success of Doom, the market slowly filled up with games attempting to offer unique takes on the first-person shooter genre. Popular games like Duke Nukem 3D presented similar layouts and progression to Doom, but with a greater focus on interactivity, while other games such as System Shock or the Terminator Skynet tried to bring extra depth to their worlds in other ways. GoldenEye, however, took a different approach to level design. Many of its maps were actually created first as actual places rather than game environments. It felt as if you were dropped into a world and asked to accomplish your objectives through exploration and experimentation. Huge sections of every map were devoid of actual objectives, but their existence helped build a more realistic environment overall. It's this open-ended sandbox design combined with the enemy behavior that leads to such a fascinating experience. To put it in modern terms, replaying missions in GoldenEye evokes a feeling similar to replaying a mission in something like Hitman. You're learning optimal routes to the levels and trying new things each time, and it pushes you to become more efficient in your playstyle. The enemy AI responds to things like sight and sound, making it possible to quietly sneak your way through sections while taking out enemies with a silenced pistol. Mission design also played a role, with objectives that increased in complexity as you increase the difficulty. It's something that we would see later in PC games such as Thief the Dark Project, and it adds greatly to the replayability factor. And it forces you to explore the levels in more detail as well. Oh, and success in these missions actually unlocks a lot of cool cheat codes to play with, something we don't often see these days. This is of course enhanced by the attention to detail on display. Enemies are motion captured with smooth animation, and each of these enemies feature a number of different reactions to gunfire. Shooting someone in the head, leg, or crotch results in different animations, for instance. Many objects within the world can also be destroyed, a very uncommon feature for its day. This is something discussed in the pre-release documents presented by Martin Hollis a few years ago, and it actually made its way into the final game. But then we come to the game's visuals. Now, the Nintendo 64 was still relatively new at this point, and one of its key advantages over other consoles at the time lies in its ability to present perspective-correct filtered textures. The world looked and felt solid. The limited texture cache of the N64, however, definitely presented issues here, as most of the textures were limited to just 32 by 32 or 64 by 64 pixels in size, but these assets were used very effectively, and the game still looks pretty good, actually. GoldenEye natively supports 16:9 widescreen mode right out of the box, in addition to various letterbox options, which is very nice. The game also pushed out the view distance much further than the competition. While Turok made it impossible to see more than a couple meters in front of your weapon, GoldenEye presented greater view distances while encouraging players to pick up weapons such as a sniper rifle and actually use it. We even see things like fake shadows in many levels, which adds to the depth. Explosions and particle effects were also impressive at the time, and I can't fail to mention the lovely moving clouds here either, something that was still kind of a big deal in 1997. Moving forward in time, I want to take a moment to talk about the Nintendo 64's anti-aliasing features, a process applied to all games which helps smooth out the image at the expense of clarity. Certain games such as Quake 64 actually allow users to disable this effect entirely, but this was not the case with most games. That is, until now. It's actually possible to change the characteristics of this filter by changing flags in the system's video interface status registers. This is made possible by using either a GameShark code or pre-made patches created using a utility made by a user known as Saturnu. You can then load these patches using something like an EverDrive. And here's how it compares. You can see that this has a significant impact on image clarity. The patched image is much sharper than the original, but dithering artifacts become much more visible. The sharper visuals can look quite nice in many games, though it does have a significant impact on the typical Nintendo 64 look, so it might not appeal to everyone. But the question I have is, does this impact performance at all? Well, before we answer that question, we need to first take a look at the game's performance in its default mode. GoldenEye isn't known for smooth frame rates, but this is the first time I've actually seen real performance numbers assigned to the game. It does target 30 FPS throughout, but often falls short, with the frame rate typically coming in around 15 to 30 frames per second, though sometimes it can actually go lower. It's pretty sluggish overall, but in 1997 it was somewhat more acceptable and common. This varies heavily per mission as well, with certain missions offering reasonably smooth performance across the board, while others feel borderline unplayable. So how does it run with the VI filters disabled then? Well, the overall experience is very similar, but we did notice a very slight boost in frame rate, as you can see here. At best, we're talking about just 2 to 3 frames per second, which is pretty significant with such a low frame rate, but the majority of the experience is actually just about identical here. Curiously, this introduction sequence also plays slightly differently. These initial screens all run at 60 frames per second, but the second this image appears on the screen here, frame rate drops to 30. Using these codes, the initial rollout then is actually 60 frames per second, at least until Bond himself appears on screen. Interesting. Of course, this is just the single player mode here, but a big part of the game's popularity actually lies in its multiplayer mode. This mode was basically created single-handedly by Stephen Ellis just a few months from launch without permission from management. It barely made it into the game at all, but ultimately is what helped define it with so many people. With so many customization options available then, it became the first truly popular multiplayer console shooter. But the real question I have is just how slowly did it actually run? Well, here's your answer. As expected, the performance falls below that of the single-player game. The maps are much less complex though, of course, but 4-player split screen is quite demanding for the hardware and results in average performance levels in the teens or worse. But somehow the performance level is just high enough that the game still remains a lot of fun today. Sitting down to play GoldenEye with friends is still a ton of fun, something I wasn't so sure would be the case when I first loaded it up. Now, thinking about the time spent with the game, it's clear that a lot of the fun actually comes from just how ridiculous it can be. You can tell that the team was just tossing in whatever they deemed fun or interesting, and it gives the game a real character. I mean, including someone like Oddjob in the multiplayer here is just ridiculous. He was unbalanced and annoying, but resulted in so many laughs when playing it. It really felt like a game that wasn't tuned to perfection, but it ultimately benefited as a result. Unfortunately, it seems that GoldenEye is destined to remain forever on the Nintendo 64. Eurocom developed a take on GoldenEye for the Wii, Xbox 360, and PS3, however, which was interesting in many ways, but ultimately played more like a game of Call of Duty than a sequel or take on the original GoldenEye. It just missed a lot of what made the original game special. Even Electronic Arts tried to get in on the action before that with GoldenEye Rogue Agent. It was released for the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube, and it's pretty much completely unrelated to the original game. It's pretty safe to say that the name GoldenEye was used for brand recognition purposes only, and it's really not a great game. But Rare itself did actually try to bring GoldenEye back. During the early days of Xbox 360, Rare actually spent time remaking GoldenEye for Microsoft's then new console. The idea was simple. A full-on 60 frames per second remake with new textures and other massive improvements designed to bring the game to a new audience. Unfortunately, this never saw the light of day. There's little media available, but this video and some screenshots were eventually leaked and now posted over on Unseen64. Known as Project Bean, Rare almost completed the game by the time it was canned. Most of the levels were functional at this point, with only minor glitches such as missing textures or broken character models present in the levels. In the 360 version here, character faces were all based on the then current Rare staff as well. One of the more interesting ideas in the works was the split-screen online multiplayer. You could play the game online with others over the internet, but it would still be possible to see their screen just as in the original game. The game's assets were all remade from scratch with new explosions, new textures, and loads of new models, but the team included an option to toggle between the new visuals and the original N64 visuals simply by tapping the right bumper. It's a shame that this never came to pass, and it was likely an issue between Activision, who held the Bond license at the time, and Nintendo that was never worked out. Interestingly, this port was actually made by Rare, while the 360 port of Perfect Dark, released years later, would be made by 4J instead. There's little doubt that GoldenEye left a huge impact on the industry though, and it changed the way that people played multiplayer games on a console. But just 3 years after its release, we received a sequel of sorts in the form of Perfect Dark. This time around, the team at Rare had different aspirations for their next game. They wanted to move to a sci-fi setting inspired by the likes of Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell, while telling a story centered on aliens with a lead female protagonist. By this point in the Nintendo 64's life, Rare was extremely familiar with the hardware, and Perfect Dark maximizes and often exceeds its capabilities. There are a huge number of visual improvements present in the game. Light coronas, a 2D representation of light placed around light sources, were a huge addition to the game and helped bring life to the world. New weather effects were used to enhance the atmosphere in certain missions. Each and every scene featured more intricately detailed texture work along with improved light and shadow representation. A basic motion blur technique shows up in certain instances, and a blur effect is used to simulate depth of field in the menu system even. Animation is expanded upon as well. Enemies react even more convincingly, and weapon reloading animations were added this time, something absent in GoldenEye. Of course, Perfect Dark also took advantage of the Nintendo 64 expansion pack. So much so that the game is pretty much inaccessible without this pack installed, making it basically a requirement here. Start up the game without the expansion pack installed and you get this, the small but perfect menu. The only thing you can really do at this point is play around with some of the challenge maps. It's basically just a demo version of the game, lacking even the Carrington Institute, which serves as a background for the full games menu. Now, once you pop in an expansion pack, you're greeted with many more options, including a full single-player campaign, co-op missions, and a massive multiplayer mode. It's packed with features. As was common at this point in the N64's life cycle, it was also possible to run the game in a high or low resolution mode. The low resolution mode, which is the default for the game, runs at 320 by 222 on NTSC consoles and 320 by 268 on PAL consoles. Engaging the high-res mode, however, switches to 640 by 222 for the US version and 448 by 268 on PAL consoles. What's interesting about this is that the game does not actually switch to an interlaced mode as with many other games. Instead, we're basically seeing an early take on super sampling. The game is still outputting at 240p, but you gain extra clarity all around due to the increased horizontal resolution. It really does look quite nice. Oh, and that anti-aliasing removal trick I use in GoldenEye? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be compatible with Perfect Dark, unfortunately. Now, it's obvious that the high-res mode runs slower than the low-res mode default, but I did want to put some actual numbers on it, starting with some cutscenes from the single-player campaign. Here's how the two stack up. On average, we're looking at a roughly 2 to 3 frame advantage in favor of the low-resolution mode here. It's not much, really, but when your frame rate is already below 15 frames per second, it can definitely make a difference. Still, there's no denying that image quality is much cleaner in the high-res mode, even at 240p. The extra clarity on display definitely adds a lot to the presentation. We see similar results here in the introduction cutscene as well. Cleaner overall visuals, but a slightly lower level of performance. And while we're here, this part of the skybox, the Blade Runner-esque city, is interesting because all of the building textures are lacking bilinear filtering, which was pretty much used in every other Nintendo 64 game. It's an interesting choice, and it likely is included just to make the buildings look sharper at a distance. You're probably noticing by now that performance in general is subpar, to say the least. In fact, this is one of the game's biggest problems. For all the additional visual features added, the frame rate is just low enough to become extremely bothersome. GoldenEye was hardly smooth, of course, but it was just at the limit of acceptability. Perfect Dark, however, takes things to a new low and pushes the boundaries of what is acceptable. Perhaps it would have been smart to release the game on GameCube instead of the N64, as we saw with Star Fox Adventures, but who can say? Split screen is another matter entirely, of course. In low-res mode, performance is expectedly poor, but not too far off from what we saw in GoldenEye. It's still very playable and lots of fun, though it never really feels fluid. But really, this is the optimal way to play Perfect Dark in multiplayer, at least on the Nintendo 64 hardware. But then we have a new feature, bots. Known as simulants, these AI-controlled enemies can be added to the match, enhancing the multiplayer experience but also dragging down performance in the process. Here's how those bots impact performance in the low-resolution mode. But then it's time to push the N64 to the breaking point with both simulants and the high-resolution mode enabled. Here we've reached the point where the game just kinda breaks. The level of performance is so low that it becomes nearly impossible to effectively play the game. Just moving your character or lining up shots is a chore, and the game really isn't very much fun in this mode. It's neat that such an option was included, just to hammer the system, but it's really not a good way to enjoy Perfect Dark. Which brings us to the actual best way to play Perfect Dark, the Xbox 360 version. Ported by 4J Studios, this port of Perfect Dark includes all of the improvements we would have expected from Rare's 360 GoldenEye port, all at 1080p, 60 frames per second. Each of the game's textures have been remade at a higher resolution, while many of the game's models have been updated as well. When comparing the original version to the remake, the difference is clear. Everything is just so incredibly sharp and clean now, but the biggest improvement stems from performance. With a smooth, stable 60 frames per second in play, this updated version of Perfect Dark looks and plays better than the original ever could. Beyond that, the controls have been updated to take advantage of the Xbox 360 pad, which, coupled with the superior analog sticks, makes for a more playable game than ever. It really is a fantastic port all around. Which is why playing this version of Perfect Dark is perhaps the best way to relive the memories of Rare's N64 shooters. Getting 4 360 pads together for a round of Perfect Dark is much less of an ordeal and will undoubtedly lead to a better overall experience. Revisiting these games has proven interesting for me as well in that sense. It's been a long time since I picked up the original GoldenEye or even Perfect Dark and had naively assumed that these games would have aged very poorly. I was wrong. There is a real spark here, something that feels truly unique and different from modern day shooters. The open-ended gameplay, experimental level design, and mountains of options really stand out. Many of the qualities that have made the 2016 version of Hitman so memorable and playable for many people were really kind of present already in this 1997 game. Even when compared against technically superior PC shooters of 1997, GoldenEye still manages to impress. It really is a timeless game held back only by the technical limitations of the Nintendo 64 itself. Which is why many users now look to mods. Case in point, GoldenEye's Source, a mod created in the image of the N64 original using the Source engine. In fact, just as I'm putting the finishing touches on this video, GoldenEye Source 5.0 is set to release, and by the time you've watched this video, it should be available for download. Now, this is a very different thing and has its own unique look and feel, but I do think it captures many elements of the game quite nicely. The original alpha version of the mod was actually released over 10 years ago. While it's focused on multiplayer, many of the original single-player maps have actually been recreated with many additions designed to enable a smoother multiplayer experience. It's a neat mod and one worth checking out for sure. And with that, we're out of time. I hope you enjoyed this look back at GoldenEye and Perfect Dark on the N64. I know I did. Now, back in '97, I wasn't really into console gaming as much. It was more of a PC phase for me, so I didn't really appreciate what these games were doing at the time, especially GoldenEye. But in revisiting it and trying to understand what was really on offer, I realized that it was actually very forward-looking, and not just in terms of multiplayer. The whole mission structure and open-ended design is actually not something we saw too much of, even on the PC back then. Sure, I mean, games like the original Hitman would attempt to offer things like this, as I mentioned in the video, and we'd see sort of a continuation of the wide open spaces in games like Far Cry. But in '97, being able to explore these massive levels, often with areas that were not necessarily required to complete the mission, but were there to add to the world, it was a really cool thing, and I really get it now. Plus, of course, the multiplayer stuff. All the customization and options is really good stuff. So, keeping that in mind, if you have been away from these games for a long time, I definitely encourage you to go give them a second look. Yeah, there's definitely technical rough edges, of course, unless you play the Xbox 360 version of Perfect Dark, of course. But there's still really good games. And anyway, that's about all the time we have for now, so if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and until next time, stay retro. What's next for DF Retro? Well, next week I'm off to Gamescom, so there may not be a new episode next weekend, but with the upcoming release of Deus Ex Mankind Divided, perhaps it's time to take a look at that series next. So I'll leave it up to you guys. Would you rather see the original Deus Ex on PC and PS2, or shall I jump straight to Invisible War on PC and the original Xbox instead? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments and we'll go from there.